Okay, it is noon. Hello, everybody. My name is Dorit Donneville, and I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our speaker today. So given that we have nearly 400 pre-registrations online for this topic, this is definitely an area of great interest for many people around the world. And we are really thrilled because our speaker actually spends her time on the other side of the world from us. And so she doesn't come to North America very often. And so when we heard she was going to be in our neighborhood, so to speak, on the East Coast, we asked her to come here. And so it's been a remarkable visit. So I just wanted to put this into context for you. Our involvement really at Baylor College of Medicine in the space program is one that has actually been now 3 decades. Baylor College of Medicine leads a consortium with Caltech and MIT to help NASA solve some of the biggest challenges of humans exploring deep space. And we have many challenges to figure out, like radiation and medical capabilities when you're off the planet. But we also have a simple problem of how to feed people and feed them for long periods of time when they don't have access to fresh foods. We also have the concern of a very confined environment, long periods of time with communication delays with Earth. And those things actually present major mental health challenges for crews that will find themselves with 3 other people that their boss picked out for them in a very confined space, having to live for 2 to 3 years. And so mental challenges, physical challenges, food challenges, those are all things that the space program is trying to solve and is partnered with Baylor to do that. So the Center for Space Medicine here at Baylor, as well as the Translational Research Institute for Space Health, TRISH, is really honored to have a speaker today who will speak to you about some major topics with regards to how we nourish our bodies for not just physical health, but also mental health. And so we're really thrilled to have Professor Felice Jacka with us today. So she has a couple of letters, or 3 letters after her name, and all of us needed to look them up. The OAM, which is really a huge honor in the country of Australia. It's the Medal of Order that's given to a member of the public for exceptional public service. And I think after you hear her talk, you will understand why she has been able to move the needle on our understanding and the prioritization of nutrition in our overall health and mental health, and really has resulted in policy changes which are remarkable over a period of a decade. And some of these things actually take more than a decade. 17 years, I think, was a statistic you mentioned. Anyway, we're thrilled to have her speak to us about this today. So Professor Jacka is a professor of nutritional psychiatry. She actually established this field and the director of Food and Mood Center at Deakin University in Australia. She's also the founder and the president of the International Society for Nutritional Psychiatry. And what is so remarkable is that she has seen effects in studies that have been traditionally very difficult to perform. Nutritional studies have been very difficult, and psychiatry studies have been very difficult. So she has made progress in 2 fields that are incredibly difficult. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Felice.
Thank you so much, Dorit, and thank you to all of my hosts at NASA and TRISH who've looked after me so well, and we've had the most fabulous time. And I got to tour the space station yesterday, and we've had some fantastic meals and some fantastic conversations and brainstorms, and it's been just really remarkable visit. Can everyone hear me okay? I just want to make sure that, I'm mic'd up appropriately. All right, that's fantastic. Now, I'm very aware that without, keeping an eye on the time, I can talk forever. And in fact, yesterday I talked for a lot longer than I meant to. So this time I'm going to speak a little bit more quickly and more efficiently so that we have some time for questions at the end, because there are always many, many questions. And what I love about talking about this topic is that everyone's interested, and it's because everybody eats. Everybody has an interest in food, whether it's for their health or pleasure or culture or whatever the reason. And of course, everyone also has mental health of one sort or another. 50% of the population will be affected by a mental health problem at some point in their life, a clinically relevant mental health problem. So understanding that these two things are connected is very powerful, and it's very exciting for people. And this is why I think we have so much interest in this field. So I'm going to start off with the context, which I think is particularly notable in the US, but certainly in Western countries such as Australia and the UK in particular, which is our industrialised food environment. Some have called it the obesogenic food environment. And this is the environment where when you're walking down the street or you're going to put petrol in your car, you will be met with opportunities to consume foods that are highly manufactured, ultra-processed. They've been specially engineered to interact with all the reward systems of your brain so that you want them, you crave them, you want more of them. They bypass apparently our appetite regulation system so that we will overeat them. And in this environment, it's very hard to automatically, as a default, make good food choices. And we know that because of this, the impact on global health and the environment of the industrialized food system is just massive. Now, this particular report that was published in 2019 estimated the cost to global health and the environment of upwards of $12 trillion a year. Now, I just spent Monday in New York with the World Economic Forum. They've done their own modelling and they estimate it to be closer to $20 trillion a year. So 16 trillion in a year is the GDP of China. So this is the industrialised food system and its impact on health and the environment. Health alone, $11 trillion a year. The big global burden of disease study that collects all the data from around the world on risk factors for disease and the burden of illness associated with disease, regularly, every iterative publication tells us that dietary risks, poor diet, and the consequences of that, so high blood glucose, high blood pressure, high body mass index, the leading cause of early mortality. And when they're talking about poor diet, they're talking about some really basic and fundamental things, diets that are low in fruits and vegetables, whole grain cereals. So these are things like oats and barley and rye and quinoa, nuts and seeds. Fibre is really key. I'm going to talk a bit more about that later. The long chain omega-3 fatty acids that we get from fish, polyunsaturated fatty acids, but also diets that are high in red meat, processed meat, added sugars, sugar-sweetened beverages, trans fats and sodium. So around the world, regularly, sugar-sweetened beverages, sodas, account for the largest amount of these free sugars in the diet, the added sugars. And this is why in many areas you have these taxes that are starting to appear on these to try and, modify our behaviour. But the reality is that because the players in this space are so huge and so powerful, and they have so many means at their disposal to influence, political decisions, we see very, very little movement in terms of restricting access to these foods, making them more difficult to get, restricting marketing so that they're not advertised to kids during kids' television hours or sponsoring kids' sports, etc. And so because of this, they've had a major impact on the environment, on health. But what is also having a major impact and has done for a long time are mental disorders. So that same big global burden of disease study tells us that mental disorders impose the largest burden of disability. So disability, not necessarily early mortality, although we know that that's an outcome because there's a 20-year mortality gap between people who do and don't have a mental disorder, and that's largely to do with chronic diseases such as heart disease. But the disability that comes from not being able to fully participate in society and the workforce and education and these sorts of things. And the biggest chunk of that slice of the pie are what we call the common mental disorders, depression and anxiety. Now, in many areas such as Australia, there's been a huge effort over the last 10, 15 years to reduce stigma and increase access to treatment. And yet we have seen no shift in the population prevalence of these disorders. And of course, during COVID, we actually saw that dial shift upwards. So We know also that there's been no new treatments for depression for decades. And the ones that we do have don't help everyone. In fact, there's as many as 50% of people that are not helped by antidepressant medications and or psychotherapy. So this is another reason why we need to think a bit differently about how we tackle this huge burden of disability that arises from mental disorders. But nutritional psychiatry is where these two things come together. It's where these two global causes of ill health and early death come together. So what is it? Well, what it is the research developing and evaluating nutritional approaches to the prevention and treatment of mental and brain disorders and their comorbidities. These means the chronic diseases that go with them very commonly. So that's as well as things like metabolic disease, with things like IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, and gut symptoms. And then it's the application of that evidence base. And that application is broad. It's clinical settings, how we treat patients, but also public health, prevention, and then thinking more laterally, food policy. How do we change that food environment to make healthy eating the default? But what it isn't, and I think this is critical, it's complementary medicine, integrative medicine, alternative medicine, and functional medicine. Now, these things, unfortunately, these terms are quite loaded. They come with a suggestion of them not having an evidence base, that they sit alongside medicine because they don't have the same rigorous evidence base that real medicine has. Now, the point with what we do with nutritional psychiatry is generate the very best quality evidence that we can. Now, nutritional research is very difficult for a whole host of reasons to do with measurement, adherence, all sorts of things. But there's also been a lot of problems around the methodologies. Things like nutritional epidemiology, where studies haven't been pre-registered and where the methodological quality has not been as good as it could be. We really tackle that. With our Food and Mood Centre program, we are very, very focused on scientific rigour. And I think that that's at least part of the reason that we've had such traction in policy and practice is because of the rigour of what we do. So our Food and Mood Centre is relatively young, but we've already grown to nearly 60. We have a very broad program of research that spans the lifespan from early life, neurodevelopment, right up to a healthy aging, looking at factors that affect the risk for dementia, population health, large-scale randomised controlled trials that are like pragmatic trials, real-world trials, clinical interventions, looking in depth at mechanisms of action, and then very much education and training, which is often talked about, but very often not supported in research. How do you take this evidence and get it into clinical practice? We know from a very large body of research now for more than a decade that diet quality is linked to mental health right across the lifespan, from the very start of life and early life nutrition right the way through to old age. This was my PhD study. It was the first study to look at the link between the quality of people's diets and their clinical depressive and anxiety disorders, taking into account all of these other factors that might affect that relationship, things like education and income and body weight and other health behaviours, for example. And it created quite a stir when it was published. Medscape Psychiatry called it the most important study in psychiatry for 2010. And it got published on the front cover of the American Journal of Psychiatry, which now seems really quaint because it's a cross-sectional observational study. But the reason it had that impact, it was because it was thinking about things in a different way. And I was fortunate in that I came into psychiatry research from a very non-conventional background. I was an artist. It was my second career. And I think that it allowed me to think a little bit differently. And there were a whole range of factors that made it seem pertinent to me that you might look at nutrition in relation to mental and brain health. This growing field of psychoneuroimmunology, where we started to understand that the immune system was really intimately linked with our mental disorder risk, but also in a bidirectional manner. Then this new field of evidence that looked at this region of the brain called the hippocampus, which we started to understand was very plastic and could be modified by dietary interventions. the immune system being very clearly modified by what we eat, and a few other strands of evidence that made me think that it would be really worth looking at this. So this is what I proposed for my PhD, and this is what came out. Now, around the same time, there were 2 other key studies that were published, also in leading journals, and it really kicked off this whole field. And so now, 12 years later, we have a very large and comprehensive evidence base from countries, cultures, and right across the age range concerning this link between the quality of the food that we eat and our risk for depression as the most common and the most burdensome of all of the mental disorders. This is just one of the several meta-analyses that have been published. And what it does is it tells us that whichever way you measure healthy diet, and this is very important to understand, it doesn't just need to be a specific diet, a Mediterranean diet, or a traditional Norwegian diet, or a traditional Japanese diet. It's just a diet that is higher in whole foods, plant foods, good quality sources of protein and fat, and lower in those ultra-processed foods that have added sugar, salt, and all sorts of other things. And if you are eating a diet that's higher in that, even when we take into account all of those other important factors, we see that the risk for developing depression is actually reduced by about 1/3. So that's very powerful at the population level, especially given that everybody eats. Half of all mental disorders start before the age of 14. If we're thinking about prevention, this is a really important fact. Knowing that there are many, many studies now that tie the quality of young people's diets to their mental health in a dose-response manner, even when we take into account really important factors. One of these studies, for example, I did in East London, a very, very difficult, disadvantaged community. Even when we take into account things like drug and substance use and low social support and all of these other factors, we still see that the kids who are having more of these unhealthful Western-type foods are twice as likely to have elevated psychological distress and depression and all of these other factors. In Australia, and this is very common in many countries, teenagers, this very vulnerable group where their reward systems are very sensitive and very activated, and they love junk food for that reason, they're having on average about 7 serves a day. 7 serves a day of these sorts of foods. And then when we go right back to the very start of life, there are many, many data showing that the quality of mothers' diets during pregnancy is linked to the emotional, behavioural and cognitive outcomes in children. Now, importantly, this is not a large effect size, and that's an important understanding because, you know, women have enough to feel guilty about without thinking that because they ate a whole lot of junk food during their pregnancy, their children are going to have a mental disorder. It's not about that. It's about saying this is a factor that affects everybody, and if we modify it at the population level, we may actually be able to address quite a big burden of outcomes, just simply because 100% of the population are affected. This is just one example. This is a study that published last year with a very large Norwegian MOBIS study, which has tens of thousands of mothers and their children. This was a surprise to me because we think about ADHD as being a very genetically determined condition. But here we saw that the quality of mums' diets, and this is a measure of their healthy food intake, this is a measure of their ultra-processed food intake, and this is a measure of the children's diet quality, was linked to their ADHD symptoms. And then we also looked at diagnoses from medical records and saw the same pattern of associations, not as strong, but still very, very obvious. So this is just one example, but there are many, suggesting that if we can optimize or at least improve dietary intakes during pregnancy, that we may improve outcomes for kids. Now, in the US, 60% of children alive today will be clinically obese by the time they're 35. This is their main age when they're having children. And if we want to interrupt that intergenerational transmission of diseases, we need to be thinking how we can improve the health of the parents, and not just the mothers. There are also data from fathers linking the father's health and metabolic health to their children's risk for autism spectrum disorders. It may work through epigenetics, we don't know. The research is still too new, but it obviously has huge implications for the next generation. In Australia, 99% of them don't have enough vegetables according to the dietary guidelines. And this is in a country where we have absolute access, except for those in the most remote areas, to really good quality food. But this is again the impact of the industrialized food system. It's marketing, it's making these convenience foods cheap, incredibly available, heavily marketed, and very, very palatable, such that they become the norm. We think about the determinants of mental disorders. They're things that are often very difficult to change. They're things like genetics and early life trauma and life stress and poverty, disadvantage. The fact that we can modify lifestyle, including diet, is very, very important from the point of view of population health and prevention. We also know, though, correlation doesn't equal causation. So while we have a huge body of evidence now that's very consistent in describing these associations between diet quality and depression outcomes, and in many cases anxiety as well, and we do our best to take into account all those other factors that might explain that relationship, we need clinical trials to say that one causes the other. Now, because this is a new field, to date we only have 4 such clinical trials, but their findings are super, super consistent and very, very striking. So the first was our SMILES trial, and many of you may have heard about this because it's a very well-known trial. And what we did in this, and it was a really difficult trial to run. I was an early postdoc when I put this protocol together. We got some funding, but it wasn't enough. We ran it, very, very inexpensively. And it took us 3 years just to recruit 67 people because nobody thought that diet was going to be useful to treat such a serious disorder. Because what we were doing was recruiting people with moderate to severe major depressive disorder. Many of these people have been very sick for a long time, on the couch, very large doses of antidepressants, living on coffee and cigarettes and wine, really at the end of their tether. We had several people say, this trial was my last hope. They were just so desperate. They were randomly assigned to get either nutritional counselling from a dietitian or social support, which we know is really helpful for people with depression. And because we had so few people compared to what we'd hoped to recruit, and because I don't think ourselves thought that diet would make that much of a difference, we did not expect to see a difference between the groups in the end in terms of their depressive symptoms. But what we saw was a very, very large difference, such that a full third of people in that dietary support group went on to achieve full remission of their depression. It's what's called a very large effect size. So we were really stunned. But when we looked deeper, what we saw was very convincing. We saw that the degree of change in depressive symptoms correlated very closely with the degree to which people improved their diet quality. We were making recommendations that were very accessible, simple, affordable. Frozen vegetables, tinned and dried legumes and beans, tinned fish, things that people would be able to access very easily, prepare very quickly, and that were really affordable. Because when we think about healthy diet, we often think this, it has to be organic foods and fresh fish and the best of everything, which of course is super expensive. But in fact, the diet we were advocating was actually cheaper than the junk food diet that people were eating when they came into the study. We did a detailed cost analysis, and our diet was actually cheaper because you can eat very well, very cheaply. We also had a health economist on the team, and they did a detailed economic evaluation. And these are the sorts of data that you need to get policymakers to change, recommendations and policy. We saw that there was roughly a $2,500 Australian dollar per participant cost saving for everyone who was in the dietary group, because they lost less time out of their roles, their daily roles, and they saw other health professionals less often. So in Australia, we have a huge burden to the healthcare system, billions and billions of dollars, but also to business and industry. $10 billion a year is the estimate in Australia, and that's a population of only 25 million. So this is saying this is a highly, highly cost-effective way to think about treating depression, because you get a global benefit to functioning, to physical health, as well as the mental health benefit. Now, there's been 3 other dietary randomized controlled trials of people with depression, and they've shown the same thing. The most recent was in young men. This is a very difficult group to get to change their diet. They not only did change their diet, they experienced a huge benefit. There's another one in university students, only went for 3 weeks. We know that they changed their diet because they measured flavonoids in the blood using a spectrophotometer. They also saw big gains. Another study in a group-based setting did similar to us, and they also did an economic valuation. They also found that it was highly, highly cost-effective. So these trials are really compelling and really useful. But what we also did was a big meta-analysis where we looked at trials where they'd done a dietary intervention for a different endpoint, so maybe metabolic disease or some other endpoint, but they happened to have measured depression and anxiety. And we see that dietary interventions improve depressive symptoms. That's what this section here means. We saw fewer studies for anxiety, and the effect wasn't statistically significant, except when we looked at the studies where they use a dietitian, a nutritional professional, to deliver the intervention. Then we see benefits. And I think that this is key, because a dietitian doesn't know just what to eat or what not to eat. They know how to help people to get there. And this is the thing, you don't do great, big, huge wholesale changes. You do things that are small and achievable. But the other thing that I would say about this, this body of work that's so important, 2 things. One is these changes happened independent of any change in body weight. If you look at the observational data, those relationships between diet quality, depression, anxiety, they exist independent of body weight. In the SMILES trial, the average body mass index of people was roughly 30, and that didn't change. These are not weight loss recommendations. And this is key. And then going back to the other study I just mentioned about young people and young men who don't pay any attention to dietary messages. If you are pushing this idea that the only reason you need to worry about your diet is your body weight and obesity, you're not going to get anywhere, because A, it's stigmatizing, but B, people just give up. Body weight is a very difficult, complex construct, very heavily genetically informed, and most people really struggle to lose body weight once they have a larger body, and if they do, they struggle to keep it off. So they just give up and they don't listen to those messages. For young people, if you say, don't eat that way, one day you're going to have a heart attack or diabetes, they switch off. We don't, as humans, think about that future cost. We think about something that's immediate. When people recognise that this is relevant to how they're going to be feeling tomorrow, next week, their emotional health, their mental health, their clarity of thought, this really cuts through and it really leverages behaviour change. And I think that that's a very important message for public health and for those public health messages. When we think about mechanisms of action, there's many. This is a review that we published in Molecular Psychiatry a couple of years ago, if people are interested, where we go through all of these different factors that we know are influenced by diet, but that are also involved in depressive illness. So these are things like epigenetics, how our genes are switched on and off, our stress response system, tryptophan kynurenine metabolism, which influences the amount of neurotransmitters in the brain, particularly serotonin. Neurogenesis, we know that there's this key region of the brain called the hippocampus that actually grows new neurons throughout life and is very clearly influenced by diet as well as exercise. And we've shown this now in humans in 3 studies, and as well as all of the really extensive animal evidence. So this key region of the brain is really important, not just for mental health, but how we learn and remember. Inflammation and oxidative stress, so our immune system's very importantly involved in mental health in a bidirectional manner. the way our mitochondria function. But then the gut microbiota, which links all of these things and which we're particularly interested in. This new understanding that these microbes that we've co-evolved with, that live on us and in us, we can't live without them, they can't live without us. They are like our factory for producing the molecules that run all of our systems. They are our organ of adaptation. They are really important primarily for breaking down the components of food that our own human enzymes can't break down. So when we look at all these things that influence the microbes that live in our gut, diet is arguably the most important and certainly something that is very readily modifiable. You change diet, you get an impact on the gut microbiome very, very quickly. So they digest, absorb, metabolize, and transform plant fibers and polyphenols primarily. These are the things that our own human enzymes don't break down. When we eat fiber in all sorts of, and it needs to be different types of fiber, not just what you get from vegetables or fruits, but things like whole grains and legumes, beans, chickpeas, navy beans, all of these different sorts of beans, nuts and seeds. And then the polyphenols that come in colourful vegetables and herbs and spices. These make their way down into our large bowel, and the bacteria break them down, they ferment them, and in doing so, they produce thousands of different molecules that influence our metabolism, the way our liver runs, our body weight, our immune system. Something like 70% of our immune cells are actually in the gut. They affect gene regulation, they affect brain plasticity, they affect virtually every single system in the body. They are the powerhouses of the way we function, but we don't feed them. We're not feeding them what they need to be able to operate. They do all sorts of other things as well. Some of those metabolites include even vitamins like vitamin Bs. Short-chain fatty acids we think are very, very important, helping to regulate our immune function and many other things. They also affect how we metabolize drugs. They help to protect us from pathogens. And this idea of this intestinal barrier function is very important. People will have heard of this term leaky gut, colloquially, but it actually, the barrier on our gut is very important and very important part of our immune system. And when it is leaky, we do have a problem and we do have more inflammation in our systems. So we want to keep our gut lining healthy. We also want to keep our bacteria diverse. Now, if you think about a rainforest compared to a plantation of pine trees, a diverse rainforest is a really healthy rainforest. It's a really resilient rainforest. It has so many different organisms, large and small, and plants and trees, and this whole ecosystem that works synergistically to make a healthy, resilient forest. A plantation is very, very vulnerable to a single disease or pathogen coming in and wiping it out. It has no resilience. And this is the analogy. We see that the diversity of the gut microbiome is linked to so many diseases. I think the cancer knowledge here is really important. We're increasingly seeing from large human studies that people who have a more diverse, healthier microbiome are much more likely to respond to immunotherapy, to chemotherapy, to stem cell treatment. They're now even doing fecal transplants from people who have responded to immunotherapy into people who haven't responded to immunotherapy. The health of our gut is key to both prevention and treatment of all of these different health outcomes. How do you get a diverse gut microbiota? Well, from the data that we do have from the Large American Gut Project, people who had more than 30 different types of plants every week had a more diverse gut bacteria to those that had fewer than 10 plants. That makes sense. This is what bacteria eat, plants. And the more diverse your plant intake, the more diverse your gut microbiota, because all the gut microbiota are optimized to do different things. So for example, in Japan, people will have gut bacteria that break down seaweed. How they get in there, what's the chicken and the egg, we still don't understand that. That's something that we really need to figure out. But people think 30 plants, oh my goodness, that's 30 different sorts of vegetables. I can't do that. It's actually not that hard. It's not just vegetables, it's also fruits. It's also, you know, your breakfast cereal. Can you swap it out a bit? You know, oats, you can have barley, you can have chia seeds, you can have buckwheat, you can have brown rice, and you can have black rice. There you've already got a whole multitude of different types of plants, different sorts of nuts, almonds, cashews, walnuts, pecans. You've got herbs, you've got spices, these all count. Getting that diversity, not just eating beans and potatoes every day. This is what your gut likes and what your gut bacteria really prefers. We see this loss of diversity in our food system, which correlates, of course, with the loss of biodiversity in the environment as we've gone on from hunter-gatherer to agricultural to industrialised food in this very processed, sanitised food environment. We have lost diversity in our gut, and that loss has correlated closely with the increases in obesity and also allergic and immune-mediated diseases. So things like asthma and eczema, but also things like MS and celiac disease and autoimmune conditions. One of the big issues, I think, is the antibiotics in the food chain. More than 80% of antibiotics in use today actually they're used in cattle and poultry farming. That has been hugely problematic, I think, because of course it's affected the gut microbiome. And often what they've been used for is to make those animals fatter. And sort of thinking about that, and then you're putting them in your system, and, you know, it's obviously problematic. We know that when people move from more traditional societies and diets to the US, we see this westernization of the human gut, this loss of diversity associated with increases in obesity, as well as other sorts of chronic diseases, and it's compounded across generations. We know from the animal work, this is Justin Sonnenberg's group and Erica Sonnenberg in the US, that low MAC diets, so MACs are microbial accessible carbohydrates. So these are your complex carbohydrates that you get from plant foods. Over generations, on a low MAC diet, diversity of the gut is lost, keystone species are lost, and then even when you introduce dietary fibre again, you cannot get them back. They need to actually do poo transplants to get those bacteria back in. This is the operating environment for us as people living in the West. This is a great study that really, I think, highlights this issue. So in this study, this was way back in 2014, but it was a great proof of concept. They did microbiome sampling from people who were living a traditional diet and lifestyle in South Africa, so South Africans, and then they also looked at African Americans living with a SAD, a standard American diet. They found that the South Africans had a far more diverse microbiome and lower levels of markers of inflammation that we know are linked to colon cancer risk, whereas the African Americans, they had a less diverse microbiome and elevated levels of those markers. And then what they did was that they swapped their diets for 2 weeks. So the poor South Africans got the SAD and their cancer markers went up and their diversity went down, and the opposite happened for the African Americans. So this is just one of many studies that just shows you can change your microbiome and your markers of health very quickly by swapping your diet over. This is a really cool recent study, just been published. Again, this is from the Sonnenberg group, and this was an intervention study. And they assigned people, Americans, having, you know, a normal American diet, to receive either a high fermented food diet or a high fibre diet. They wanted to see what was the best strategy for increasing diversity and lowering inflammation. Inflammation is this low-grade chronic activation of the immune system that we know is involved in so many chronic diseases. What they found was surprising and not surprising. So the fermented food group, who over a period of 3 weeks gradually increased their intake of fermented foods, so these are things like sauerkraut and kombucha and kefir and yogurt, they had a reduction in inflammation and an increase in diversity. But the ones who got the higher fiber diet, and all they were asked to do was to increase their fiber intake by measly 20 grams a day on top of what they were already eating, which was pretty low. The ones who had higher diversity of their microbiome to start with, they did okay. You know, their diversity increased, inflammation went down. But the ones who had low microbial diversity to start with, they did really badly. And this is something that I hear over and over again, is that people trying to introduce fiber and plants into their diet, they really struggle. They get huge stomach upsets. They feel terrible. So they thought, well, maybe it's that they don't have the microbes that need to be there to break down the carbohydrates. So they went and looked, and indeed, that's what it looks like is the case. They found undigested fiber in their digestive tract. So this is the key thing. If you're going to make changes, do them very, very gradually. We think that maybe including fermented foods in with those changes might be really helpful. We don't know that for sure yet. But I do think that it just exemplifies this issue of our gut microbiome as absolute deserts in a Western environment full of antibiotics and low diversity foods and low nutrition foods. And we need to proceed very slowly and carefully, but we do need to proceed. Fermented foods, we think, are super, super interesting. The three main functional components of fermented foods are the actual microorganisms themselves. Even when they're dead, they can exert they have bioactive properties. The prebiotics, so that's whatever the food is that you've given the microbes to eat. So it's sauerkraut, this would be chopped up cabbage. But the biogenics, it's what they produce. So when bugs break down food in your gut, they're producing all of these molecules through largely a process of fermentation. Fermented foods are doing the same thing, but they're just doing it in a jar or in a bottle. And all of these things that are produced by the bacteria, such as vitamins, neurotransmitters, and all of these other things are produced, and you consume them when you consume fermented foods. So we're doing a trial at the moment, fermented dairy versus a placebo fermented dairy in women, looking at brain metabolites, brain structure, a whole host of cognitive outcomes, of course, the microbiome and other blood markers. We're running this as one of the many, many studies that we're doing at the Food and Mood Centre at the moment. I think it's going to be very interesting. We have a very extensive microbiome research program, very focused on gold standard methods, looking at clinical trials and epidemiology, very interested in neurodevelopment and the infant microbiome and how we might modify mothers' diets to influence the infant microbiome and outcomes, oral microbiome and Alzheimer's disease. So we're doing a lot here because that diet, gut microbiota, or microbiota, gut brain axis, mental health triad is one that we're very interested in. And I think we're the only group in the world who are really looking at this in detail. So COVID put the kibosh on a lot of our work, but much of it is now underway again, and we'll be publishing over the next couple of years. We're also really interested in personalised nutrition, and this is part of what we've been talking to NASA about. How do we get there? Moving from broad recommendations, and here this image really is probably more relevant for different types of drug therapy, where we know that people react very differently to the same drug. Some people will get a benefit, some will get no effect, some will actually have an adverse effect. How can we use the power now of big data to move towards understanding what works for whom under what circumstances? And this is what we want to do with food and nutrition. Using all of these amazing computational processes that we now have and power that we now have at our disposal, where you take large numbers of data, use these AI and machine learning technologies, and develop algorithms that can predict disease, but also potentially predict how people were going to respond to any given input. And this is what we are very, very keen to progress with. This is a study that was really the first one that really kicked off a lot of people's thinking around this. This was published in Cell in 2015, and I still remember when it was published because it was so exciting. Their interest was in blood glucose, so postprandial blood glucose levels. When you eat, your blood glucose goes up, and it is thought that there is clinical relevance even in people who don't have diabetes, to how your blood glucose responds after a meal. So they monitored for a week blood glucose levels in 800 people. They measured responses to over 46,000 meals, including a whole host of standard meals. So basically giving the same meal to lots of people and looking at how their blood glucose responded. From those data, they were able to devise or establish an algorithm using all of these sorts of data, things from their blood, their dietary habits, their body habitus, physical activity, but the gut microbiota was key because we think that this is the main reason why people respond differently to diet or to medications. Our human genes play a role, but it looks like the microbial genes may be more important. They then validated those predictions in an independent cohort, and then they did a randomized controlled trial to test whether their algorithm-driven recommendations did better than just standard recommendations, and found that they did. And from that, they developed an app called Day 2. Not incredibly precise, but certainly a very, very useful contribution to the science. And then since then, the group over at King's College, with whom I'm now working closely, did the same in the very large PREDICT study, and they did it with a greater degree of accuracy, where they are looking at blood glucose as an endpoint, but they're also very interested in moving beyond this. And this is where we're going to be working with them to look at a whole host of outcomes, including mood. And they set up this Zoe app that some of you will have heard of. In the UK, it's got a 250,000 person waiting list to join it. And basically you'll have 2 weeks of measurements of all sorts that are sent to you, and you send back, and then you'll get a personalised program for how to you know, have the best glucose outcome. But I think it can be extended beyond that. We've had a big impact on practice and policy. In Australia, our Royal Australian New Zealand College of Psychiatrists clinical guidelines for the treatment of mood disorders now has essentially what is lifestyle medicine as the foundation. They call it the foundation. They call it essentially non-negotiable. Sleep, regular exercise, achieving a healthy diet, and ceasing substances that can be, you know, doing harm to mood before you move on to other sorts of treatment. 2019, we set up an international task force to develop the first evidence-based set of clinical guidelines for lifestyle-based care in mental health treatment. These have just been published with the World Federation of Societies of Biological Psychiatry just 2 weeks ago. Huge body of work, nearly 30,000 words, 3 years worth of work that our centre has led. And these are designed to be used by any health practitioner in any setting. So I think that these are going to be very useful for psychiatry and for medicine. But this, of course, is the big translation gap. So we know that medical practitioners get almost no training in nutrition throughout their medical degrees. And yet they're very, very happy to make recommendations that are often not evidence-based and sometimes can even be problematic. So we're aiming to address this. First, we set up our free online course in food and mood, which is now one of the most popular in the world. It's already enrolled more than 78,000 people from more than 180 countries. It's very much designed for the lay public, teachers and the like. But we've just, after 2 years of working with the Royal Australian New Zealand College of Psychiatrists, we now have the first accredited training for nutritional psychiatry. It's geared towards medical professionals. And it's endorsed by the Royal Australian New Zealand College. So if people are interested in learning more and becoming, getting an accredited, you know, training in this area, this is now available through the Food and Mood Centre website. But this is the big issue. You know, you can give all the lifestyle advice in the world, but gee, it's hard when the whole food environment is working against you. And this is where my interest in policy comes in. Our work's been cited in more than 80 different policy documents. We now have the new World Mental Health Report that for the first time lists unhealthy diet as a risk factor for mental disorders. This is so important, so exciting. The work that we've done in PsyCom has been very, very useful. So this is the cover of Time magazine, the cover of the Oprah magazine, Scientific American, the New York Times, Washington Post, Guardian. All of these have done big, big, big pieces on the work that we've led. And the field have a lot of interest in South America. So this has really helped to get the whole field on the agenda in the public consciousness. My husband and I, I've written a couple of books, but this is my favourite. This is the kids' book that we published a couple of years ago. Now, it's a sneaky way to actually reach the parents and the teachers and the grandparents via the kids, because it's around this idea that if it's very concrete, you put food in your mouth, it goes down into that zoo in your poo. You're the zookeeper, you have to look after it. And that zoo does all sorts of things that you really need it to do. So I think that these sorts of concepts that are very concrete, they really leverage behaviour change much better than talking about obesity or talking about long-term health outcomes. And this is what we want to leverage to improve population dietary habits. So very simply, after all that complex information from research, what are the really just key fundamentals? More plants, more diversity of plants. Doesn't need to be a vegan or vegetarian diet. But if you're going to eat meat, don't eat processed meat. Eat proper meat and, you know, have the plants as 3/4 of the plate and the meat as 1/4. Far, far less of the ultra-processed food. Please, this is where we think we're going to get a lot of traction. If people could just do that one thing of avoiding the things that come in packets and have additives and things, that will go a long way. And we think that including fermented foods is going to be really useful, although we need more evidence to be able to make those firm recommendations. So that's actually pretty simple. Doesn't need to be an expensive, organic, fancy, perfect diet by any means. It's just about making those small changes every day to improve the quality of the diet, to nurture yourself, to think about yourself as a beautiful Porsche, and you want to put the best quality petrol into that Porsche, not watered down, sandy, dirty muck. And that's the analogy. You are a beautiful being. Treat yourself as such. This is our Food and Mood Centre. We've got lots and lots of blogs and information on there and resources, and increasingly more and more resources. And so if you'd like to know more, do go along and have a look at that. So there, look, I've even got a few minutes left over.
Thank you. I'm Monica Alzate, and I provide mental health services at one of the clinics here at Baylor. And I'm a firm believer in the food and mood connection. And I talk to my patients about it, even though I ate all my potato chips today. But I have encountered, in the real life, I have encountered this problem. It's like a vicious cycle. People are depressed, and therefore they don't even have the energy to cook.
Yes.
And in the United States, here in Houston, there are food deserts and food swamps.
Yes.
And this is a very recent example of a patient of mine who has lots of physical health problems and anxiety and depression and almost all of the adverse childhood experiences you can imagine. And I mentioned the food issue. And then she told me there are no places where I can buy good food here. And I said, that cannot be. I Googled her address, and yes, the closest farmer's market was 11 miles away, and she doesn't drive.
No.
So when it comes to real life,
Yeah.
I really like that you have also studies on how to eat properly on a low budget, because that was her first thing.
Yeah.
I go to the supermarket and the good food costs too much, and I have a whole family to feed.
That's right.
So when it comes to real life, then what challenges have you encountered? And I know that the context in Australia is different, but what challenges?
I think it's more that the context in America is uniquely challenging, I think. But if that person is going to the supermarket, this is where frozen vegetables are fabulous. You don't need to go to a farmer's market. Frozen veg, a brilliant way to inexpensively access vegetables and fruits with fantastic nutritional qualities in a way that there's no wastage. Dried beans and tin beans, also from the supermarket, very accessible, very easy to prepare. tinned fish, you know, if you're going to have fish twice a week, sardines, mackerel, very inexpensive, really easy to access from the supermarket. So I think that there are ways around it, but then it's a matter of education. So we partnered with Mental Health America about 3 years ago to write a bit of a, you know, like a shopping list. I would do things very differently now, and knowing now what I know. And I think working with people who are affected is the best way to develop resources for them. So people like your patient, okay, what would help you? What would really solve a particular issue for you? Is it getting a $20 crock pot from Kmart and once a week doing a big cook up with barley and beans and veggies that are frozen and everything's already chopped up, and you just throw it in there, and that will actually, and if you want to put some meat in there, go for it, if that's going to get your family to eat it. And that will provide meals for the next 3 nights. So those sorts of recommendations. The course that we have, the NutriPsych course, touches on this. It's these practical things, ideas about how you can help patients. But I do think it's a massive problem, and this is why I have such a focus on policy and changing policy so that there aren't food deserts and that people can access decent food at a price that's affordable. Yeah, but also the psychiatrist. If you're a psychiatrist, if the patient knows that you're taking this seriously, and even if you say, look, we know that because you have a mental disorder, on average, you're going to have a shorter lifespan, and that's going to be because of cardiometabolic illness. So we want to look after your cardiometabolic health as well as your mental and brain health. And you treat them as the whole person and you take it seriously, and this is where the guidelines, I think, are so useful, then the patient does listen, rather than if the practitioner just sort of says, oh, well, you should eat a healthy diet. Well, that doesn't mean anything to them. But it is a very difficult problem.
Thank you.
Hi, awesome work, really fascinating. So I'm Michelle Patrick, I'm a psychologist and director of research at the Menninger Clinic. And I was curious if you see the same effects for different psychiatric disorders, not just depression. A lot of the literature reviewed was depression, but if you could comment on effects of diet on other psychiatric and mental health disorders, as well as comorbidity.
Yeah.
Depression is often comorbid with a lot of diagnoses,
Right.
including at our clinic. So,
Look, it's a great question, and this is where the recency of the field limits what we know, because it's only just over a decade old, and the clinical trials to date have only been done in depression. We're trying to get funding. We're interested in specific disorders too, because it may be that for something like a bipolar disorder where you get mitochondrial involvement, that something like a ketogenic diet might be useful in that particular medical condition. We're generating pilot data from a big study in Finland, but it's one of those evidence-free zones at the moment, and yet people are making a lot of recommendations that without the RCT evidence. There have been some really interesting case studies just recently published. Nobody's done it in schizophrenia yet, other than it has been done in schizophrenia. It's been shown that with the most basic support from, in this particular case, the Keeping Body and Mind study in Sydney in Australia, very famous study, because with no funding and just a student dietitian and a student exercise physiologist and some secondhand gym equipment and one stove, they ran a program in a setting where they had patients who were newly diagnosed with a psychotic illness and having to go on to antipsychotic treatment, which we know imposes a huge, it really damages metabolic health. And they were able to mitigate nearly the entire impact on metabolic health and weight that was sustained even 2 years later, just with that small amount of intervention. And this is where I think clinical nihilism has been such a problem in psychiatry, and that people have thought, well, it's not clinically relevant, they're self-comfort behaviours, they'll never change anyway, so why bother? Now, we know that when people understand that this is going to affect their mental health, they do change their diet. They only need just a little bit of basic guidance and information, as long as it's sensible, accessible, and, not too complicated. So I think that we're really interested in doing this in other conditions. In schizophrenia, we do see an impact, a positive benefit to cognition, which of course is really important in a psychotic disorder. But there's still a lot to do. Getting funding is always challenging. We're running a lot more trials. One of the issues is, with dietary trials, how do you blind the control condition and sort of try to avoid expectation bias? So we've got sneaky ways of doing that now, and we're running some big other studies. So there's lots still to be done in the field. It's a very new field, but all of the signs are very consistently pointing to this being really important. And of course, you do get a benefit then to comorbid health conditions. You'd probably be aware of the Lancet Psychiatry Commission report in 2019, led by our great colleague, Jo Firth, who made a whole blueprint to improving the physical health of people with mental disorders and trying to mitigate that average 20-year mortality gap. That's being updated. Our new lifestyle guidelines go alongside that to try and support this approach. I think with the gut, we know from extensive evidence that the most common somatic symptoms that accompany depression and anxiety are gut symptoms. And there's this bidirectional relationship that even if you leave the microbiota out of the picture from the vagus nerve and the gut-brain axis, we've just finished a feasibility trial of poo transplants in major depressive disorder. They're doing poo transplants in cancer, in Crohn's disease, in all sorts of IBD, because there's huge benefit to targeting the gut, because the gut is the powerhouse of all of these other things. So you get that right, then everything else is improved, including metabolic health. Thank you. Thanks so much. And thanks for organising. It's been great.